Hi everyone, my name is Rohit. I'm a coach and co-owner at Ascend Speech and Debate, and I'm the former 2020 TOC champion. I am now joined here by the new 2021 TOC champion, Andrew Sun.
Hey everyone, I'm Andrew. I'm a current senior. I go to Harker School in San Jose, California. And yeah, I'm going to be coaching at a so yeah.
Yeah. All right. So today we are going to be interviewing Andrew about the TOC that just recently completed and asking him some questions about how to prepare for the TOC, how the tournament is different from other tournaments. And then we're going to watch one of his speeches and talk about the speech in particular. So hopefully y'all could get some really good advice from here. And hopefully it's an interesting interview to watch. So the first thing that I want to start off with, Andrew, is how do you think the TOC is different in comparison to other tournaments? Because I know a lot of kids, when they're going to the TOC for the first time, they're really worried that it's going to be a huge step up from all the invitationals they've competed at. And a lot of them don't really know what to expect. So, how do you think it's different from other normal tournaments?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's a step up because obviously everyone who's at the tournament has done well at least two national tournaments across that school year. I would say though that the biggest difference I always feel when I go to the TOC is the bills. I mean, TOC is pretty famous for you're not going to find much overlap with the bills that are being debated with the bills that have been debated throughout the season. Like usually tournament to tournament, you might see a little bit of like, oh, I've debated this before, so I can use some of my knowledge from a previous round.
Yeah.
For TOC, that's definitely different, and so there's a lot more of a preparation burden, I would say.
Hmm.
And so my thing has always been always got to prep a little more for the TOC going into it. You can feel a little more confident about what you have, and that's really it has a lot to do with how well you can prepare for these specific bills that most people really haven't talked about before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about that, right? So I think that a lot of people are concerned, especially with at the TOC, how the bills are so different that prepping can be really hard, and especially if you're from a small school or you don't have a lot of friends that are prepping with you, and you have to prep everything yourself. How did you approach that? Like, did you have a team that you were prepping with together? Were you prepping pretty much everything yourself? Were there any ways that you changed your prep style or the way that you researched specifically for the TOC in comparison to other tournaments? Talk to me a little bit about that process.
Yeah, so my teammate Nathan and I were good friends. We're representing Harker for the TOC, and so usually when Harker goes to a tournament, there's more than two people, so it felt a little bit different, obviously, and we had to be a lot more proactive with ourselves. Like, okay, we got to split this up here, do this by then. And I will also say that the research process, the way it's different is that you have to really dig deep into the background of a bill before you even start thinking about what the arguments might be.
Hmm.
Um, I've always researched bills by you first understand like the news context behind any issue to the point where you can really decipher like, okay, this is what the core debate is going to be about.
Yeah.
What is really this discussion? What is the core of this discussion? And from there you can start thinking of what stance you want to take, what stances you want to research. And so that doesn't change for the TUC. The difference for the TUC is you have to spend a lot more time on that first part. And
Hmm.
so part of that is just staying up to date with the news.
Hmm.
Part of that is also making an active effort to push yourself to do that research on that background, because often background really just informs the arguments you're making, the refutations you
Yeah.
make, and how you decide to say what you want to say in round. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a big thing that we stress to kids a lot, especially nowadays with just the abundance of information that's around you, is that the more background information you have, the better you will be prepared for a round, right? And it seems that this like never really goes to waste. So I want to ask you then, how much do you think that in regards to the TOC, but in regards to tournaments overall, how much do you think the prep process is made easier or changed by you staying up to date with the news or researching into issues when you don't have a tournament coming up, right? So even if I don't have specific bills or a specific issue I'm supposed to look into, how much do you think it helps you for a tournament if you are researching into issues on your free time or just staying up to date with the news?
I would say that the research process, regardless if you have a tournament or not, and like the news, like staying up to date with the news process, is really about making connections with what you already know to what you're just learning about.
Mhm.
And so my one of the things I create analogous connections between what I'm researched on to maybe even if the bills don't seem similar, there's probably something you can take from it that there's a previous debate that will help inform what you can say for a future debate. And so that's why I always kind of think to myself after each tournament, what what part of that round is something I really want to reflect more on.
Mhm.
Like usually without fail, every round that I'm in, after that round's over, there'll be one thing that's said at least where I'm like, I didn't think of that. I want to learn more about that. And so there's just a whole treasury of things that you can do. I mean, between tournaments, even if there is no tournament coming up, where you can just kind of like think about what those rounds contained and how this applies to the real world. And the more you can think about that, I mean, this event's really grounded in the real world. And so that process has always helped me a lot. And we can talk about that more with the like more specifically with the speech part of this, but just generally making those connections to me is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, 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 absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And with that in mind, then I want to transition to talking a little bit about specifically during tournaments, right? So once you're already prepared, kind of what is your process during tournaments, right? Because a lot of times with debate in particular, right? With there being so much preparation that goes into every tournament and so much stuff that's getting done before the tournament starts, a lot of times I feel like kids are really confused about what exactly is the process that they should be going through in between rounds, and while the tournament is going on, what should you be doing, right? Should you be giving practice speeches? Should you be doing more background research? Should you be coming up with more arguments, just reading over your research and trying to improve your prep, right? Like, what is the best course of action in your opinion? And especially in regards to online debate, right? Where it seems like you have so much free time in between rounds in comparison to in-person tournaments, right? What do you think is the most effective way for you to spend that free time? Or at least what is your process of how you prepare for the next round while you're already at the tournament?
Yeah. So I will first say eat and sleep. I eat between rounds and then obviously sleep enough between games. I actually, in preparation for tournaments, these tournaments are obviously they're online. People are from different time zones. It's a bit of a burden, a little bit on the West Coast kids, right? The rounds start at like 8 a.m. I actually, for the 3 or 4 days before tournament starts, whenever there's a tournament, make an effort to like adjust my sleep schedule so that I don't feel like super groggy when I'm giving that first speech in the morning.
Hmm.
Generally, I would say before a round starts, like if it's the first round of the day, you never want that first speech you give in round to be the first thing you've said all morning.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, like sometimes I just like search on Google like 2 minute vocal warm up, and
Mhm.
then just like say stuff out loud and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
get rid of that morning voice. I would say in between round, it's contextual to feel in terms of the next debate. I
Mhm.
always look at the first. So if they're debated next time, make sure I'm confident with what I'm with what I'm going to say. I feel okay feeling a little less confident on that second bill, knowing that there's time and but my big thing is also thinking of the values that I want to promote with each round that I'm in. And sometimes I want it to be consistent across the 2 or 3 speeches that I give. And
Mhm.
so I want to pick out like, okay, here's what I really want to represent in this round. And that's kind of, I think, being sincere to the role playing aspect of this event, which I think is a little underrated in the
Mhm.
activity. I think a lot of the time it's just like we're out here to debate, but you're also trying to represent a persona as a member of Congress. And I
Yeah.
feel like it's glossed over a little bit. And so that's why I sometimes between rounds, I'm thinking a lot about, okay, this speech that or this stance I'm going to give, because even though the speech might change, I kind of know what I generally want to say in my stance.
Yeah.
What values can I attach to that in terms of my intro conclusion or between speeches or how I'm asking these questions? It's something that I like to think about in between rounds.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really good advice, especially for a lot of kids, that reach the point in their debate career where they learn how to make good arguments, and they can give good speeches, but they're kind of looking for that it factor, as they would put it, that really pushes you from just being a good debater to being a great debater to being a really memorable one. And I think that this is one of the things that really shines, right? Is that really memorable debaters, it doesn't just feel like they're standing in affirmation or negation of a certain bill or on a certain issue, but it feels like they are standing for a certain value, and they're standing for a certain idea. And that idea or that value transcends just the debate that you're having right now, right? It's about, like you said, it's about the entire round, right? All three issues, I'm standing for a value, right? Or even to the point where it just seems like they're a memorable person because they stand for this value with everything in their life, right? And this is something that they consistently promote. And I think that's really good advice that helps take you from just being a speaker that can make good arguments and that can give good speeches to now being a speaker that's memorable, right? And being a speaker that the judges are going to remember for a certain reason beyond just, oh, he had good arguments or good refutations and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great advice. Um, with all that being said, I think it would help us then to talk about a specific speech. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and I'm going to play Andrew's speech, his first speech from the TOC final round this year. I'll mute my mic so that way it doesn't echo a whole bunch. And after that, we can break down the speech a little bit and I'll ask you some questions about the decisions in there.
Rohit, it's not playing, or I can't hear anything.
Okay, maybe I have to stay unmuted. Let me.
When you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're holding a gun, everything looks like a target. For too long, the only community relationship this Congress has empowered with our inaction is that with police. And the result? People are literally getting shot on the street. I'm asking this Congress to have the courage to hold the institution of the police accountable, to diversify our toolkit. The point of today's bill has been misrepresented this entire debate. This legislation is intended to reduce the influence and role of the police. This debate has given us 3 warrants as to why that is the case. First, Section 2 increases funding to community development. American Progress explains last July that Richmond, 10 years after launching a community development office, decreased homicide rates by 80%. This statistic outweighs any arguments that negation senators can bring up about the funding loss toward police departments. Because Brookings in June explains that a 60-year study explained that increased funding to police did not significantly correlate with less crime. But the second warrant here is Section 3, funding to decrease mass incarceration. I'd actually like to distance myself from Senator Martinez and take this another direction. Courts explains in 2015 that mass incarceration systems from the states have caused a net increase in crime because of the increase of recidivism and costs. These 2 warrants jointly mean that when you decrease crime under today's legislation, you decrease the necessity or the influence of the police to begin with. Third and finally, the third warrant that's been contested is Section 1, cutting off federal funding to the police. Senator Marocha tells you this decreases the number of police. I agree completely. The rest of my speech is about turning the impact of a shortage of police. It is the best way for this Congress to move forward to decrease number of police on the streets. Here's why. The reason that police unions representing police have leverage and power in the status quo to push for reforms is 1, because police have such an outsized role, and 2, because there's so many officers. Senator Chellary, that's why we need to cut off funding from police as well as increase funding to community initiatives. Because as crime goes down and number of officers go down, unions have less leverage for their malicious reforms. Spectrum News explains in 2019 that after the officer who killed Eric Gordon was fired, NYPD arrests decreased significantly as unions called for the commissioner's resignation, exactly because unions have flexed their leverage in the past due to their outsized role. But as crime goes down and numbers go down, these unions' powers go down as well. This is all incredibly important because it is the most direct link to the impact about police violence. Senator Mazumdar in cross-examination is worried about cuts to training, but police don't kill because they're untrained. They kill because there's no accountability for their actions. NPR explains in January that after gaining union rights, officers killed substantially more civilians in each county where the overwhelming majority of citizens were non-white. Senator Juneja and Mehrotra are worried about federal oversight, but federal oversight in terms of funding doesn't matter if the unions in power continue to push for the reforms such as qualified immunity and arbitration choices that allow police to escape scot-free from crimes. Finally, Senator Chellary, the very fact that police are bad, as you imply with your entire speech, is the entire reason we must hold them accountable. This bill is that first step. This Congress's only job is to hold ourselves accountable to our civilians. Their lives depend on our courage to use our greatest tool, our vote.
Thank you, Senator Sun, for that speech of 4 minutes and 9 seconds. All those wishing to question, please raise your placard. Goes first to Senator Mehrotra.
Why do police officers come for individuals in the first place?
Comfort or come for?
Like come for.
Because there's been a call.
Or and when they do, why do they increasingly want to arrest them?
Because they don't feel like there are any consequences for their actions.
Is it the sentencing nature of our justice system that ensures that?
No, it's because police know that even if they are fired for misconduct, they can be rehired.
No,
and many times they aren't fired in the first place.
Why do we revert to arrests in the first place? Is it because of
Thank you, Senators. We move to Senator Juneja.
Hi, Senator. So what type of leverage do we have over police unions and all of that when we pass?
The leverage we have with this bill that is increased is the leverage that comes from local leaders who have more leverage to say no to police unions.
Have local leaders empirically done anything to combat?
The status quo shows that they haven't done much because they don't have leverage, because police unions have so much power. I am arguing we need to gradually decrease their role.
How does taking away our funding increase local city?
The warrants I explained first 2 minutes of my speech, 3 warrants right there.
Thank you, Senators.
Thank you.
Negation speakers.
Awesome, cool. So the first thing that I want to ask you about, actually, beyond just the speech in particular, is that one thing that a lot of kids are worried about at the TOC is cross-examination, right? And getting cross-examined by speakers that all know what they're doing, obviously, by evidence of them being there, and might be better than the cross-examination sessions that you've had normally at other tournaments, right? So I think that it's very noticeable when you are in cross-ex sessions, you have this very calm demeanor to you, and you don't seem to be phased in any way. You also don't seem to be angry or in any way bewildered by the questioner. You have this habit of making using a very calm demeanor and making very controlled, composed responses, right? So I want to ask you about, how do you think that helps you, and especially at the TOC when you're dealing with better cross-examiners, right? How do you think it helps you to, instead of getting scared or instead of getting angry on the other end of the spectrum, right, or using too much aggression, to kind of stay in the middle with a very calm demeanor?
Yeah, I'll first say that to kind of frame how cross-ex I believe really should work, I got this really cool ballot this school year for one of my tournaments where the judge was like, you should use cross-ex as the opportunity to explain instead of getting frustrated over, their questions.
Yeah.
And so reframing cross-ex like that in my mind has been super helpful, and has kind of led to that demeanor in cross-ex, which hasn't always been how I've answered cross-ex questions. And I think that's really helpful because instead of treating it as like they're trying to attack you, if you treat it as like they're trying to seek more nuance in what you're trying to explain, it's actually the best opportunity you have. It's more time for you to showcase your knowledge about what you're trying to argue. I would also say that it comes down to really understanding the limits of what you're arguing, like what is relevant to what you're arguing and what isn't relevant.
Yeah.
If someone is asking you something that sounds like it's putting you in a compromising position. In many cases, it's either the premise that you can contest based on your argument, or it's that argument's like running parallel to what you're trying to say. Usually it's the first case. And so knowing how your argument is constructed in terms of the warranting is really, really helpful. I would also say that at TOC, with the fun round, they give you more time to flesh out your warrants. And so 30 seconds is usually not nearly enough time for someone to do away with multiple warrants, usually just one warrant. And so that last answer that I had there at the very end was highlighting that fact. Like there's a lot more that you need to accomplish than in the 30 seconds when it comes to, I don't know, like dismantling an entire point. But that's what speeches are for. So that's how I view cross-ex.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think those are all really good points, right? And I would also just like point out that it seems that when you employ this demeanor, right, or with speakers in general that are calmer and cross-ex, it feels like more is getting done, and it feels like something actually comes out of cross-ex sessions, which 9 times out of 10 is leaning towards the side of the person who is able to stay calmer, right? And I remember particularly during my career, right, this is like a similar stance that I took my senior year, where both in asking and answering questions, I was like, I'm gonna take a very calm demeanor, right? And I like would use it as a contrast to my speaking style to specifically call out that in cross-examination, like the points that I was making were much more of this like explanatory form. Or if I'm asking a question, right, it's not that I'm like trying to ram down the argument with like a battering ram, right? It's that I'm trying to poke holes to the point where the judge can see that maybe there are some holes in the argument, right? Because as you said, I don't think cross-ex is the opportunity to break down an entire argument, right? I think it's the opportunity for you to poke small holes or for you to explain stuff that covers up the small holes, right? So yeah, I think those are all really good points.
I would also really quickly say that in Zoom,
Mm-hmm.
much more productive to be calmer.
Yeah.
I've actually found that when you're calmer, instead of raising your voice, you're actually more likely to get your point across, in
Yeah.
the sense that when someone starts to raise their voice and then someone goes back by raising, it's just hard to hear. It's just
Yeah.
how Zoom works.
100%.
Less so in person, but in Zoom, that's just how it works. And so you
Yeah.
kind of just have to be calmer. I think in Zoom versus your speech, when obviously in your speech you have the floor is yours. No one's speaking over you. You can speak however you want. But then I kind of believe in cross-exes. You should be a little, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really good point. That on Zoom, every time I hear kids get into shouting matches, right? At least during in-person tournaments, I could somewhat understand both of their points, but on Zoom, I end up really confused. Yeah. No, the next thing I want to ask you about is speech structure, right? So it seems that the speech structure that you had in that speech was easy to follow, right? And easy to flow, but somewhat unconventional in that it doesn't really fit like any of the structures that a lot of kids will like completely stick to, right? For example, CWEI or CWDI being one of the big ones, right? It seems that the structure has changed a little bit, right? For example, you have 3 different warrants on like going through the entire speech, right? And then at the end, the entire bottom is just an impact turn, right? So I want to ask you that what structure do you use, and do you use a structure that defines every single speech, or is it more free flowing, and do you change things depending on the round?
Okay. So I'm one of those people that's still writes stuff down on my pad. I mean, you could tell like I stood up and then I had stuff on my pad. When I prep on my computer, I do CWDI,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also aware, like, okay, so like a 3-minute speech, for instance, maybe you can run 2 CWDIs, but as I've gotten older, I've kind of just like strayed away from that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of preferred like you have like a first half section, which is like about the warranting / solvency of a bill. And this applies for AFRMEG.
Yeah.
And the second part explaining why that matters, or like what's the consequence, which is what you just identify, like warranting and then impact.
Yeah.
Which broadly follows CWDI. I think it's more flexible though. So when I prep for rounds, 9 times out of 10, I will not say exactly what I have on my computer
Mm-hmm.
when I'm speaking.
Mm-hmm.
For that speech, for instance, that third warrant, I obviously had intended to explain that out, but there was already someone on the other side who had explained that for me.
Mm-hmm.
At which point, just use that. I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
it comes down to like, okay, what do I agree with this person on? highlighting that, because it is, I mean, you do have, part of the job is to find common ground.
Yeah.
And then pinpointing where you disagree with that person and establishing that point of comparison. That's really the goal of all this. And so the structure itself, to me, is never that important. I've probably used like a million different structures with my speeches and tried a bunch of different ones. And I wouldn't say that one is like way better than the other. I think it comes down to creating a very consistent narrative as to where your speech is going, both values wise and practically what is the bill doing that the status quo can't, or if you're on F, what is the bill doing to harm the status quo?
Yeah, 100%. No, and I think that's a big thing that I stress to kids as well, is that structure is really helpful, especially towards the beginning of your career, in terms of getting down all of the important things that you need to have in a speech, right? And for example, CWEI is great because it really drills into your head that if I am creating an argument, these are the things that need to exist in an argument, right? And though from there, I always point out to kids that, at the end of my career, I was not using one specific structure for every speech, right? In fact, it was hard to point to two speeches of mine and say that they were the same structure at all, because it was always me sitting in the round, right? And by that point, I knew what went into an argument. So it's really just, what do I think that this round needs the most in terms of my speech structure, right? And molding it to fit that. So I want to ask you, how big of a turning point do you think it was in your career, or how much do you think it propelled you forward when you were willing to forego just giving like conventionally structured speeches for every single speech, and now more willing to be flexible, move stuff in, cut stuff out, and kind of rearrange stuff and really change the structure?
Yeah. So when I started doing this was around my sophomore year, around that time, but not nearly as nuanced as what I'm doing now as a senior.
Yeah.
In sophomore year, I kind of gave more crystal speeches. And so those are obviously not the traditional structure that you might expect from like just the 2-point constructive.
Yeah.
And I weirdly also kind of learned how to give those better than the constructives to begin with. It was a very backwards progression. And so that actually helped me a lot. In my specific case, it helped me a lot because I mean, crystal speeches are really about what is the most important thing. The term is collapse. Like, what is the most important thing in the round? I'm going to talk about that mostly. And so throughout sophomore year, I kind of did that. And I kind of felt like there was improvement. And throughout my upperclassmen years, as I kind of moved back to like the earlier to mid type speeches, it wasn't anymore the CWDI, although that was what I prep on the laptop. The laptop is just the reference point. Like, okay,
yeah, exactly.
I have this idea. You can pull it out of your hat if you want, but if you don't, I mean, you don't use it. And so there are speeches where I talk exclusively about impacts. There are speeches where I talk pretty much exclusively about the warrants of a bill rounded out with the values, because they're just different bills that demand different debates.
Exactly.
And that's also the value of being dynamic, because what you have prepared may not fit within the dynamic of a round. You have to be willing at that point to take the risk, to trust yourself. And the only way to really build that up, in my opinion, is to go into those rounds, at the very least practice rounds, and have those experiences where you're making those split-second decisions and you're prepping that speech really fast and you're giving it spontaneously, because you know that that's what you need to do to stand out the most, not to give a structure that de-emphasizes what's needed most in the round.
Yeah.
And so it all comes down to the fact that the biggest thing you have to achieve in Congress is you only have 3 minutes to speak, which is lower than any other debate event. That means figure out what matters the most, stick to that, and scrap everything else. It's just how it works. And so with that comes the need to kind of be willing to adapt, which I kind of built by those sophomore year crystal speeches that allowed me to progress like that. Yeah.
No, 100%. Yeah. And that's really interesting to think about, really, the progression from speaking at one point and how that begins to define your structure, and then moving to different points in the round, right? And how that changes that. And on that subject, I think this speech was about like a middle, like maybe later middle speech in the round, right?
It was middle F. Yeah, middle F.
Middle F, yeah. And obviously at the TOC, right? Like middle F is early, by comparison and to a lot of other rounds, as at least a lot of other in-person rounds, I should say. Online rounds have become smaller, yeah. But I want to ask you, do you think that, and this is a question that I feel like a lot of coaches get all the time, is do you think that there is a sweet spot for where you need to speak in a round? Like, there's a spot where speakers tend to do better or judges rank it higher? Or are you the type of person that says early, middle, or late, like a good speech is a good speech?
This is interesting. I've given throughout my time every type of speech in every type of elim round.
Hmm.
I've sponsored bills and finals before. I mean, final appeals and all that too. So I've given a last speech
Yeah.
as well, and I've given middle speeches obviously from this round. To me, what matters a lot more than when you speak is what side you speak on, and it's a little counterintuitive, but to me, there's certain values that you can promote on one side that you can't promote on the other in many cases.
Hmm.
And I think this is a bit of like the unfortunate part of Congress, which is we encourage an even debate, but sometimes it's just objectively true that one side allows you to have more leeway with promoting certain values than others. And it's a bit of
Yeah.
an inefficiency, but to me, that's how I've always looked at it. Like I, I don't, to me, it's like, okay, I mean, I stood up second half first when I, for this round, ended up getting that third half.
Hmm.
It wouldn't have mattered to me if it was third half or fifth half or whatever, because as the round goes on, you just scrap what's not needed.
Hmm.
Kind of with that third warrant, for instance, that I don't need that warrant. It's already explained. And then go really, really deep into what matters the most.
Hmm.
This is something I actually took from our round last year, your second speech. We're just all completely focused on this one point and this one like inflection point in the round that needed to be addressed that hadn't been addressed. And so it's the same concept. And so that's why to me it matters a little more like, okay, where am I, like what side am I speaking versus when that happens to be, because no matter what, your stance will still be your stance.
Hmm.
But when you go on a different side, you have to obviously change that stance.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. So then, that does like beg the question: do you think, or at least do you personally feel like walking into rounds, when you read piece of legislation, there is a side that you think is, no, I shouldn't say intrinsically better than the other side, but there is a side that you think it would be easier to get a higher rank on than the other side, like the AF, maybe it might be easier to get a better rank on the AF than the neg, or vice versa?
It's hard. I think it depends on each individual bill. I will say, I believe for each individual bill, there's probably one side you can take that is slightly better than the other side. But I've also had plenty of instances where I've either seen someone go on the other side, get kudos because it's the less argued side, and then argue it to the best of that side's ability,
Yeah.
and it's really well. And I've seen that for myself as well, but the opposite way, like both ways, like
Yeah, yeah.
it really just, I think when you're in like this type of round, all the judges are very well aware of what can be argued and what can't be argued, what is the best version of what can be argued, and where you're trying to reach with your arguments. And I think it comes down to arguing the best version of what you think you can with the side that you're given.
Mhm.
And so that's why I prep both sides always when I'm going into these rounds, even if it's just having conversations about what I think the round will be about, because that informs like, okay, I can understand what I think will be most elevated in that round. And so for that speech in particular, I thought the idea of accountability would be the most important ideal in that round. Because I could kind of like, okay, the neg is going to talk about the decrease to funding and how that affects like training, for instance. And so I kind of knew that going in. And so having that knowledge of both sides, I think is helpful as well. But yeah, I would say to an extent, but I also think it's not something that is going to like completely change the direction of a debate, because I think the judges perceive and understand like this is what you can argue with the bill given. It's sometimes just a victim of the, it's the bill, it's the bill's, it's the fault of the bill, really. And that's okay. I mean, you take what you give, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, right? That you kind of have to trust the judges that they understand this event well enough and they understand someone has to debate the weaker side and they're not going to punish you for that, right? So I think that's a really good point. The last substantive thing that I want to cover then is some of the specific decisions that you made inside this speech in regards to specific cards you read or refutations or warrants. And I want to play a fun little game here that I play with a lot of the students I'm coaching, which is that I'm going to ask you about one of the things that you said in the speech or one of the decisions you made. And then in less than 30 seconds, you have to tell me what is the value of that specific thing, right? Or why does this decision of including this and not including something else further the round, right? Or what does it add to the speech, right? And I'm not going to be timing you and stuff, obviously, but if we could keep it fast paced, I think that'd be kind of fun, right? So the first thing I want to ask you about, right? The refutation at the bottom to Senator Chellery, right? Where you point out that his speech is premised on the idea that police are bad, and that in and of itself is a reason to affirm, right? Why do you think that refutation helps you? It's not super substantive, but why do you think this refutation is something that pushes the speech forward?
Yeah, I had actually intended to spend a little more time on that. To be honest with you, the reason that the reason that it pushes the speech forward is because I think that the biggest warrant to the biggest impact is accountability.
Hmm.
And so if the neg is going to talk about, I mean, if the neg is, and they did talk about how bad the police are, then there's a bit of a tension point there. Like, what is the warrant and how does the bill link into that warrant? Which is why I spent the 2 minutes with the warrants at the top. And so that was intended to kind of showcase that I understood the implication of the warrants discussion that I had at the top of the speech to make sure that the judges understood, okay, I'm not ignoring that speech that came right before me. It was to address how that can be delinked. It's a little bit, but how that impact can be accessed by our side more than their side. Yeah.
That makes sense. So the Brookings Institute card you read, right, about the 60-year study, which finds that funding the police isn't associated with any significant decrease in crime, right? You don't explicitly tag this as any form of any form of reputation, right? And obviously, it's not explicit offense for your side, right? Because all you're saying is that police funding is not good. You're not saying getting rid of police funding is good, right? So why then do you think that you didn't have to do any of that and it still works out, right? Because it's still very impactful to hear, right? And we can all immediately put together that, oh, this delinks most of the neg, right? So why or how do you think that you framed that in such a way where you don't need to specifically point out any neg sender in particular, but we can still all reach that same conclusion?
Okay, yeah, two things. First is that it's comparative to the first card about 80% decrease in homicide rates. 80% sounds like a lot by itself, but you still need to put that in context.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
not significant is way less than 80%. The second thing I'll say is that the neg is in a bit of an interesting position where if they really want to argue for training and other forms of accountability other than police unions, they have to actually advocate for more funding to police. Because AF could come back very easily and argue that the current training given to police is not nearly enough, and neg would kind of be forced to agree.
Yeah.
So the neg is in a weird counterplan-ish position. And so the point of that card was to preempt that sort of argument, like increasing the funding is not going to help, that type of thing.
That makes sense. So then in dissecting the offense of the AF here, it seems like you have two paths, right? You can say that community investment is going to decrease crime. You can also say that decreasing police funding is going to decrease police brutality, which in turn links to crime, right? Or in turn links to all these problems, right? Now, you take a very interesting layered stance here, which is that you first dissect that community investment decreases crime, right? And then you point out that insofar as that is true, right, that in and of itself makes it so that police funding is unnecessary, right, which is like a new layer of offense for the AF, right? And then even if you don't buy that it's unnecessary, you point out to us that getting rid of funding is a good thing, right? Why do you think that this layering is more effective than just splitting your speech into two parts and just being like community investment decreases crime is my first argument. My second argument is that decreasing police funding decreases brutality.
The reason is I'm always looking for connections between arguments. Crime does not exist independently of police violence. That much we know. But to treat them as separate issues would be to probably oversimplify the debate a little bit.
Mhm.
And so the intent of that first part, that first 2 minutes, the 3 warrants there, was to draw connections between the idea of crime, the idea of decreasing the police's role, which creates the main thrust for that point about police unions. And so the way I had envisioned in my head kind of played out the way that the speech occurred, because it just so happens that these warrants all linked into this larger impact. And so I always, when I'm looking at a bill, I'm not just thinking of CWDI blocks as their own little block, but I'm trying to think of how they connect to each other. How can I create a larger value that is associated with these maybe 2 separate ones, or in this case, it was kind of like 3 separate ones with all the same impact. Yeah.
That makes sense. I want to ask you specifically about the decision to talk about unionization as the main offense of the affirmative, right? Or at least the focus of the affirmative offense for your speech. Unionization is obviously one of the more like unique takes behind how decreasing funding is going to change the police structure, right? Like reading the bill, I think a lot of people were probably thinking about like Section 1033 programs, for example, right? And there's a lot of good, strong cards that say that getting rid of Section 1033 programs is going to significantly decrease police violence, right? So this creates one very clear, albeit stock link for getting rid of funding, decreasing violence, right? You give us a more like unique link about unionization, right? And then still strongly prove the case that getting rid of funding is going to decrease the power of unionization, right? And then you point out that this is larger in scope than pretty much anything else, right? Because like unionization is the sole thing that affects pretty much every single police department across the country, right? And you point out the NPR study as well, right? Which is that unionization, especially in communities of color, is the reason why brutality has gone so bad, right? So talk to me a little bit about what affects the decision making process for you on whether you are going to go for a more unique argument or a more stock argument, right? Is it just based upon which one do you think has the bigger impact, or are there other factors that go in?
The short answer is which argument you think envelops or covers, it serves as an umbrella for the other little, like for the other debates, many debates that are happening in the round. The longer answer is this impact was reverse engineered. What I mean by that is I didn't go to this bill and then think of that argument. I went to learn about like police as an issue, arrived at the conclusion that you can't really have any substantive conversation about police violence without talking about unions, and then thought about how defunding the police affects police union. So it was backwards. And so that's, I guess, how it wasn't stock, but really it goes back to the prep process that I mentioned at the very beginning of this, which is you really got to know the status quo. You got to understand these discussions that are happening. And the way I kind of think of it is like, if you were having a sincere conversation with someone, maybe like a classmate of yours, about the police, you would include a conversation about police unions. I mean, if it was like a substantive, long conversation and you really wanted to get down to the main points, police unions is up there. Like that's like the big thing that people talk about when it comes to police accountability. It's why we debated that at the second round of prelims for this tournament, because it's a huge issue. And so, by the way, that also connects to creating connections between bills. But that's how I thought of that. And once you think of that, it's a really clear reason for accountability that I kind of think is higher level than the other impacts, and yet more broadly supported by the inner workings of the bill. So
yeah, and I mean, then we can see now, like throughout the course of this interview, how this all starts to come full circle, right? And this is how you create a good debater, right? Is that all of these things to start to connect. So, last 2 things, right? So the first thing that I want to ask about is a lot of students, in particular, that are kind of getting to the point where they're coming up with good arguments, right, or great arguments, have this really strong emphasis on quantification, right? And they're like, I want to quantify everything, right? And that's because I feel like younger debaters don't really feel that like impetus. And then you start to realize that quantifying everything really makes it more powerful. It makes it like a lot easier to point to things, right? And then I feel like there becomes this like super overemphasis on quantification at a point in your debate career, right? Where I'm sure both you went through it. I know for sure I went through it, right? Which is that you're like, if I can't quantify it, it's not a good piece of evidence, right? And it's like I shouldn't run the argument. We can see in this speech, right, that you quantify some really important things, right? You quantify the 80% decrease in homicides, right, because of community investment. on the other hand, right, there is evidence that you have that is not particularly quantified. You read the Brookings Institute study, which just says that the relationship is not significant, right? You don't need to read us any numbers. And this is probably based upon a quantified study, but you don't need to mention the numbers.
Right.
You read us the NPR study, right, which says that there is going to be a significant, or unionization caused a significant increase in the amount of brutality in particular communities of color, right? Throughout the entire explanation of that, there is no numbers. So I want you to talk to me, what is the balance between the decision making that you make about, do I need to have quantified evidence, or is qualitative evidence okay? Do you think quantified evidence is always better than qualitative evidence? Do you think it's really contextually dependent? How do you decide here?
Yeah, I will say though that when I say significant, I mean statistically significant, and so that is technically it's technically a quantification. But the more important fact is, I don't need to say the numbers, because the fact that it is statistically significant is enough for you to like understand, like, okay, this is what he's talking about.
Yeah.
I would say that as a baseline rule of thumb, you should never use evidence that contradicts your own understanding. Like, what I mean by that is, if you can't explain logically why your evidence makes sense, then it doesn't make sense for you to use the evidence, because then someone could easily come to you in questioning and be like, so can you explain logically the warranting behind this point? And so the first layer is always just understanding on a logical level what you're trying to say and how it makes sense.
Absolutely.
At which point you can then start to look at, do I want to use quantitative evidence? Do I want to use qualitative evidence? The 80% statistic I cited is impactful to me. One, because it was the first thing I cited, so I prefer quantification to kind of show you that I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then also 80% is a huge number. That's a really, really big number, especially when we're talking about the homicide rate. And so it kind of comes down to, when I read that online, I was like, wow, that's a lot. Okay, I'm going to include that. For the other evidence, for instance, when I was talking about, there was the evidence about unions like kind of pushing for the commissioner's resignation, for the NYPD, and then their arrests decreased significantly. That was more anecdotal, but to me is still very powerful, because it speaks to an event that we are all aware of, presumably. And so it's something that you don't need to kind of use a number to establish your credibility for. And so I also happen to think that if you just use numbers for everything, it becomes a little overwhelming. Like, what number am I supposed to really be listening to? And so I kind of just take the big standout numbers that made me think, wow, that's crazy, when I was reading it. Because I know, or I can at least be confident that when I'm doing that and when I'm using those numbers in a round, that my audience will have the same reaction. And so it's contextual. It depends on how I kind of perceive those studies.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting way to approach it. Yeah, that's quite interesting. I've never thought about it that way, right? But I think it balances really well as a good litmus test for whether you should use the evidence that doesn't rely upon you doing this super like heavy calculus in your head that's like, well, what exactly does this argument need and stuff, right? Because a lot of times subliminally you are making the right decision, right? And I think going with your gut here about, if the number impressed me, it is an impressive number, is a smart thing to do. The last question I want to ask you is that you seem to strike a really good balance between talking about the other side generally by just being like, the negation argues this, or the negation has failed to do this, right? You point out the entire round at the beginning of your speech, right? With the overview that says this entire round has missed the point of the bill, right? You seem to strike a good balance between that and also calling out specific senders, right? So you call out Senator Chalouri, you refute Senator Junager's argument, you refute Senator Morotra's argument, right? And you go through this balance pretty well, where it naturally feels like you make the right decision at the right time, right? There's no points in your speech where I'm like, oh, you say the entire negation, but I feel like you should have called out the specific people, right? Or alternatively, you say one person, but I feel like you should call out the entire negation. A lot of kids really struggle with this, right? And when watching speeches, and refutation speeches in particular, they're like, how do I make that decision that I'm going to be refuting the entire side, or I'm going to be refuting one specific person? How do you approach making that decision?
It depends on how relevant, sorry, I don't mean relevant. It depends on how often the neg has repeated a certain point. So if I'm just referencing someone's question in cross-examination, I'm presuming that what they're asking in cross-examination is probably going to show up in their speech later on, for instance. But that's not something that has become central to the round yet, because obviously this person hasn't spoken. It's only been brought up in cross-ex, at which point it becomes a good idea, in my opinion, to reference that specific interaction to remind the judges. It depends on how much you want to remind the judges of what they have been listening to. So if you don't need to go into specifics and just say the neg has done this, do that if you feel confident that the judges can latch on to what you're saying and be persuaded that what you're saying is actually true. Like you want them to believe that what you're saying is a truthful representation of the round. And so if you don't think you need to do much to convince them that this is the case, you just need to say neg or af or entire round, as I did at the overview. If you're intending to reference a specific point that hasn't been drawn out by other people, then it's probably better to reference a specific name. Also better for the judges because it's something that they can pull from their memory. Like, okay, yeah, this person did mention this. And that's also why when I do specific references, I often kind of tagline their what they said for a brief, like 5 seconds. So we're on the same page. It's all about like, okay, how do I communicate this in a way that maximizes word economy, but at the same time, make sure that I'm not leaving anyone behind in my train of thought.
That makes sense. All right. Well, those are all of my substantive questions about this speech. So I just want to say thank you again, Andrew, for doing this interview. I'm sure that the kids that are watching this learned a great deal of good information about the TOC and about Congress in particular. I think I should ask the question that everyone's waiting to hear, which is, are you going to be competing at NSDA this year?
I am in the house. Yeah.
You are in the house. Okay. I wish you the best of luck there, and I'm sure it will go absolutely amazing. And based upon the TOC, I think you stand a really, really good shot. So, yeah, thank you for doing this. If you'd like to work with Andrew this summer, work with me, work with any of the other great coaches that we have here at Ascend Speech and Debate, go ahead and visit ascendspeech.org. You can sign up. You can look at our different programs, look at the roster of coaches, and as always, if you ever have any questions, there are a whole bunch of people you can contact on that website that will be able to answer your questions, and we'll do it happily. So please take a look. If this interview helped you, there's a whole lot more content that we both and the rest of our coaches on the roster could share with you to help you improve this summer. With that being said, I will catch you all later.